expert care from people who care.
Hi everyone! Today we are here at the Outreach Teen and Family Services office with Grace, Kate, and a very special guest, Erin Blechman. Erin is an author, speaker, and certified grief educator whose mission is to elevate the conversation around grief, loss, mental health, and suicide. Her book, My Unexpected Journey, Reflections After Losing My Son to Suicide, chronicles the 18 months following the devastating loss of her own beloved son Max to suicide after his long battle with mental illness. Today, we will be discussing grief and loss to suicide, so listeners, please be aware that there may be some heavier topics discussed in this episode.
And so before we get into the heavier topics, just as a little icebreaker, we're going to start off with some fast 5 questions. So these are just like, would you rather, or like this or that questions, just to get us going. So the first question is sushi or ramen?
Oh, sushi.
Sushi? That was a quick answer. What about you, Grace?
I'm more of a ramen person.
Really?
Yeah, I'm also deathly afraid of raw fish. So
yeah,
I do like a good avocado roll though.
Yeah, I would say sushi too. I'm like a big fan of sushi. I'll eat it like anywhere, anytime.
Oh my gosh. Okay, would you rather travel on horseback or on a motorcycle?
Oh, a motorcycle.
Ooh.
Really? I would have to say horseback.
I'm saying horseback too. Motorcycles are scary.
I think they're awesome.
I agree.
Awesome.
I don't know if I could pull it off though. Like, I don't know if I'm cool enough. Third question is fiction or nonfiction?
Fiction.
What about you, Grace?
I like fiction.
I agree. I feel like when I read, like, I kind of like to like escape reality, and like it feels like I'm actually escaping reality if I'm reading fiction.
That's cute. Okay. Orange juice or apple juice?
Oh, orange juice.
I think I'd have to agree. Orange juice. Yeah.
I say apple juice.
Really?
I'm so weird about it. I only like orange juice if it's literally fresh squeezed, like actually like 30 seconds ago. So I'm like,
I feel like I'm not really a juice person in general.
oh, I love my juices.
Yeah.
My real choice would be pineapple juice.
Oh, pineapple juice is good.
Yeah, for sure.
Last question is, would you rather travel for 5 years in an RV or travel for 5 years in a sailboat?
Oh, that's a hard one. I think if I were in a sailboat, I'd get seasick, so I'm going to say an RV, even though the quarters would be tight.
Yeah.
I'm also going to go with an RV. I just feel like a sailboat, like, I would get so sick of the water. Like, not like seasick, just like I would be done not being able to see anything but water.
Yeah. I would say RV too. When I was younger, I used to like go on RV trips with my parents, and we'd like stay in one for 2 weeks. And if you like slide outs in the RV, it gets actually really big inside. And it's like fun. And then you can like drive anywhere, park on the side of the road.
Yeah, that sounds nice.
Yeah. I feel like with a sailboat, like, I don't know, I just
be tiny. Like if this was like a yacht, like maybe different story.
Yeah.
A cruise ship, maybe different story, but a sailboat.
Yeah. Okay, we'd like to take a moment to express our gratitude to St. Clair Health. They've been our steadfast annual sponsor, supporting our podcast for 4 consecutive years now.
At St. Clair Health, we're always improving, building on our commitment to face the challenges of today, making an impact on the communities we serve, so we can be stronger together. St. Clair Health, expert care from people who care.
All right, first question. Erin, could you tell us about Max? Like, what kind of person was he, and what made him so special to those who knew him?
Oh boy, I could talk for a long time about my Max. So he was the most interesting person I've ever known. As a little guy, he was quirky and eccentric. There was the summer I was pregnant with his little brother. He wore snow boots and shorts the whole summer. That was just kind of that was his jam. And then as he got older, he just developed this incredibly wicked sense of humor. He did stand-up comedy. He also was a musician. He played the drums and the banjo, and he was in multiple bands throughout his life. He wrote short stories, poetry, songs, obviously, the music and the lyrics. He was just very creative, sensitive, intelligent, funny, just a really, really interesting guy. He was also very much an activist. He was really, I would say he was really impacted by injustice and inequity, and he used his voice to speak up for others. And that just makes me so proud as his mom, because he just was always willing to use really his privilege to help others and to speak up for others. And that makes me really proud to call him my son.
That's amazing.
He sounds like such an amazing person.
Yeah.
I really like the snow boots and the shorts together. That's so cute.
Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, adorable.
Our next question is kind of building off of the previous question, but Erin, would you be able to share with us your journey since losing Max to suicide in June of 2020? What has the path been like for you?
Oh boy. So it has been a little over 4.5 years since we lost Max. We lost him June 3rd of 2020. So it was right in the thick of COVID. COVID started in March and we lost him just a couple of months later. Now, one of the things that I should say is that he really struggled with his mental health for about 6 or 7 years prior to his death. When he went away to college, he had his first episode of suicide ideation and had to be hospitalized. And that was the first of probably 5 or 6 times that he was hospitalized for suicide ideation. He always checked himself in because he knew that he was a risk to himself. And so we knew that we could lose him. He also, I should tell you, had epilepsy. And so he would have seizures. I don't know what the correct term is. They used to be called grand mal, but, lose consciousness, sometimes lose control of his bladder. And so we were always fearful that we would lose him either because he had hurt himself unintentionally due to a seizure or hurt himself intentionally due to his depression and anxiety. And so we were still completely blindsided and unprepared for his death when we got the phone call that he was gone. And I don't know if you can ever prepare for the death of a child. I don't know, no matter how sick or how much they struggle. So we were blindsided. And I also didn't expect it. I really expected him to get better. I thought he was going to find the right combination of medication and lifestyle factors, and that he was going to be on an upward trajectory. And then, of course, COVID hit. He lost his job. He lost his gym, a lot of his social interactions, and it just proved to be too much for him. And so when we got the call, to say I was devastated is just a gross understatement. I was completely blindsided. And that summer that we lost him, I was in a state of depression myself. I had a really difficult time getting out of bed and just didn't really have the motivation to do anything. And that was what he struggled with when he was struggling with his depression, that motivation to get out of bed, the motivation to do even the most basic things. And so during that summer, I was seeing a therapist and she encouraged me to journal. So I started to journal to try to just kind of make sense of my swirling thoughts and emotions. And that was very therapeutic for me. And then what I started to do was put some of those journal entries out on social media. And I wish I could say that my motivation was really pure and good, but it wasn't. I was tired of running into people out in public in the grocery store and having them ask me how I was. And obviously, I wasn't going to get into it in the middle of the produce section of Giant Eagle. So I often just said fine and, rushed past. But I thought if people want to know how I'm feeling, I'm going to tell them how I'm feeling. And I was not feeling good. And so I put these really raw and authentic, vulnerable posts out on social media about what it was like to lose my son. And I got really tremendous response. I had people reach back out to me, some people that I hadn't seen in years, who thanked me for my authenticity, who admitted that they were struggling, who admitted that they had children with mental health issues. And so that was where the idea of my book came from. it was because of that response that I got from putting these journal entries out on social media. And so over the course, after about 6 months, the idea came to me through, I think it was one of those social media posts. Somebody said, I think you should write a book. And I thought, okay, maybe I will. So I started to compile those journal entries into a book. I found a graphic designer to help to illustrate it and design it for me. And so I had that project to work on for the first 18 months, really from about 6 months to 18 months. And that too was very therapeutic for me, is to have that project to kind of occupy my mind and my time and be a way to continue to keep Max's memory alive. Because when you lose someone so special, I think your biggest fear is that they're going to be forgotten. And so for me to be able to really work on that book was, it was a way to focus my attention. It was therapeutic, and it was just it was a good exercise for me. And then after the book came out, which was in April of 2022, I became a certified grief educator because I wanted to come alongside other parents. And so since then, I've been running grief groups online. I have been doing book signings and author talks with my book, and also some community speaking engagements where I just talk about suicide, mental illness, and grief. So that's a long way of explaining, but it has been 4.5 years, so there's been a lot that's transpired in that time.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. That was incredible.
So powerful.
Oh,
We wanted to, this is kind of backtracking a little bit to like what you were saying in the beginning, but would you say that like COVID made the coping and grief process more difficult for your family because like everyone was isolated at home and like, I mean, it was like, I feel like for that whole like year of 2020, like we really didn't go out much. People were just like holed up in their houses. Like, what would you say about that?
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting because we had a visitation at a local funeral home, and it was during the quarantine. It was during, the
Mhm.
shutdown. And we still had hundreds of people that came through the funeral home. And I don't really know how that happened. I don't know. I think, frankly, the people that ran the funeral home kind of turned a blind eye. And,
Yeah,
it was really helpful to have that immediate outpouring of support and love. But then I would definitely say that that COVID impacted our grieving because we weren't able to probably do as many things as we would have normally done, right? Seen as
yeah,
many people. But then the other thing that I think it did for us was, I mentioned the positive response I got when I put my journal entries out on social media, because I think it was a time when everybody was struggling. There was so
yeah,
much uncertainty and fear and worry and frankly a lot of judgment and finger pointing that was going on. And so I think that maybe there was a part of our story that was better understood and maybe better embraced because everybody was operating from a baseline of just pain and difficulty. So I think in some ways it definitely you know adversely impacted our grieving, but I think in some ways it positively impacted our grief.
and I was just thinking about how you were saying like posting on social media, and especially because like during that time people couldn't really like meet up, so everyone was on social media and on their phones, and I feel like that must have definitely like um expanded like your impact and like the people you were able to reach. And also when you mentioned earlier like going to the grocery store and people asking like, oh, like how are you, like are you okay, and just I feel like being able to like actually share how you feel on social media instead of having to like run into like everyone everywhere you go and have to be like, oh, I'm like okay, I'm fine, because like what are you really supposed to say when you see people like that? Like that I guess could also be seen as like a positive of like COVID and quarantine.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point, Kate.
Many parents struggle to process such a profound loss. How did you navigate the intense grief in the early days and months after your after the loss of Max?
Well, I don't think I did it well, to be honest with you. As I said, that first summer I had a hard time getting out of bed. And I did see a therapist, and my husband and I saw a marriage therapist. So that helped with processing my grief. I started on medication probably about 8 months after losing him. I walked miles and miles and miles. That was just a way to, kind of get out some grief and some energy. I gardened. We actually installed a memorial garden on our property because after Max passed, we had friends and neighbors donate things to us. Like some people gave us a tree, we got a bench, we got a plaque, we got multiple like shrubs and perennials. And so we kind of took all of that and put it in one section of our yard and created a Max Memorial Garden. So those were all the ways that I, tried to process my grief and just kind of be therapeutic about, working through my feelings. But I would say that it wasn't until my husband and I and our other son Sam joined a suicide survivor support group that we truly began to heal. Because up until then, although we had really great support through therapists and friends and our faith community, it wasn't until we were with other people who had experienced the same kind of loss that we did that we felt understood and validated. And so I think that joining that support group was really the single biggest factor, definitely in my healing. I can't necessarily speak for my husband or my other son, but it was just being with those other people. I felt like I finally found my people. And so those were some of the ways. The other thing that I did was I read a lot of books about grief, and some of them were helpful, many were not. And that was also an impetus for me to create my book because I was trying to create a resource that would have been helpful for me, and I couldn't find it. So those were kind of all the things that I did to try to uh, process my grief and in a productive way. Because let's be honest, there's lots of unproductive ways that you can process your grief or not process your grief, I should say. And so I think that is a tendency when you suffer a profound loss is to just kind of fall into that depression and pain yourself. But it really takes work to try to get through it. So
You mentioned earlier that your therapist mentioned like journaling, and that was what really got you inspired to write your book. Would you say that did you feel like journaling was a positive way for you to cope with grief while you were navigating your loss?
definitely. Definitely. At the beginning, you have so many swirling, at least I did, so many swirling thoughts and emotions that oftentimes I couldn't even name them. I couldn't even, like, if somebody would say, like my therapist would say, well, what are you feeling now? And I'd be like, I don't even know because there were so many things. And so I think journaling really helped me to focus my energy into naming what I was feeling. And so I found journaling to be incredibly helpful in also getting all of that, just those dark thoughts and that intense pain out, because it has to go somewhere. And I think a lot of times if we hold it in, then we're hurting ourselves. That's destructive both mentally and physically. Whereas, getting it down on paper is, I just think, really helpful in processing it.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. Going back a little bit to what you were talking about before with the memorial garden, are there any other ways that you continue to celebrate Max and remember him in your day-to-day life?
Well, I talk about him a lot. I love to tell Max stories. And I think a lot of times other people take their cues from me. So if I'm comfortable talking about them, then so are they. So I do that. On special anniversaries, like his birthday, the first birthday that we had without him, we watched old home videos of him when he was little. And that was just really special. One of the other things that we've done is we've released paper lanterns in his honor. So yeah, I mean, there's little ways to do it. Like I said, talking about him to really anybody who will listen, and then bigger ways that we try to do it. I remember also one of the holidays, one of the Christmases that we celebrated, we had everybody go around the room and tell us a Mac story, and that was really fun, because not fun, but that was really interesting because there were some stories I didn't know, and nothing touches my heart more as his mom to hear a story about my boy that I didn't know before. And so it's like, getting to know a new piece of him. And that's really special. So those are just some ways.
Wow, that's so special. Thank you again for sharing. Let's take a moment to acknowledge St. Clair Health. We're deeply grateful for their generous sponsorship of the 4th season of Teens Tap In.
At St. Clair Health, we're always improving, building on our commitment to face the challenges of today, making an impact on the communities we serve so we can be stronger together by creating reliable resources that recognize all of our neighbors, with access to the highest quality healthcare, advanced care close to home, and a shared humanity that delivers on our joint vision to create a healthier community for all. St. Clair Health, expert care from people who care.
So moving on to the second part of the podcast, we have some questions that are more like extended into like our audience kind of. So we wanted to know, Erin, through this devastating experience, what have you come to understand about mental health that you wish more people knew about?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question, Kate. So when Max was struggling with his depression and anxiety, I didn't understand it. And to the point where I didn't want to understand it because I was afraid of it. Because I knew what it could do,
Mm-hmm.
right? I knew the
Yeah.
outcome that it could cause. And so I spent a lot of time trying to, I mean, frankly, basically talk him out of it, talk him out of his depression.
Yeah.
And that doesn't work. Obviously, if it were that simple, then nobody would be depressed because they would have
Yeah.
somebody say, "Oh, you don't, go out and take a walk, get some sun, absorb some vitamin D, call a friend. You have your whole life ahead of you." Those kind of things aren't helpful, and so I wish I knew back then what I know now. In that, when he couldn't get out of bed, it wasn't that he didn't want to get out of bed; it's that he literally couldn't get out of bed
Yeah.
because what I've learned is that the opposite of depression is not happiness, it's motivation. And so he literally lacked the motivation to get out of bed, to do the most basic things. And I didn't understand that. One of the things that one of his therapists told us when he was alive was when he's in a depressive episode, he doesn't want you to pull him out of the pit. He wants you to get in the pit with him. And that didn't mean that he wanted us to be depressed with him. He just wanted us to be there and to sit with him. He didn't want us to try to talk him out of his depression like I tried to do, make helpful suggestions like I tried to do. He just wanted us to be with him, to sit with him. And, these are things that I've learned about mental illness since losing him because of my own depression after his death and my grief. Like when I was in the early deep dark days of grief, I didn't want somebody to try to talk me out of my grief. I didn't want somebody to point out all my blessings or you know just try to cheer me up. There was no cheering me up, and the same is true of mental illness. It's an illness just like diabetes or heart disease, and we need to start treating it as such rather than a passing mood, a behavioral problem, a lack of faith, all of the things that I think we tend to do with mental illness. So, those are some things I wish I knew that I wish others also could know. And unfortunately, it took his death for me to learn those. And that's a deep regret. That's a deep regret that I'll have to live with for the rest of my life. So,
I agree. I feel like we often hear terms like depression or like anxiety, and like a lot of times I feel like people who maybe haven't experienced it themselves or don't really know that much about it just think depression is like, oh, you're just sad. like, oh, just like get up and like hang out with your friends and do something. But excuse me, I feel like it's so much more than that. And it's like I feel like people need to be able to like feel or like try to feel what other people are feeling before they're like quick to judge or like what somebody should do. Because like you said, I think the point about like how he wanted you guys to be there with him, like embracing your feelings and like that's the way you're able to like move forward. But if someone is just telling you like, oh, you're not depressed, like just like be happy, like think about all the things that like all the privileges in your life and all the things to be grateful for, like that doesn't make you feel any less depressed.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of times people who don't know much about mental illness really underestimate the severity of it and what it truly is like to live with it, and that it's not just something you can be like, oh, if you like smile or if you just like go for a walk, go in the sun, it'll go away. Like, that is not how it works.
Mm-mm.
But that's just sometimes the stigma around it, that it's a lot, that it's easier to get rid of than it actually is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you both say those things because like let's take diabetes for an example. Let's say there is a young adult or a teenager that has um, you know, childhood onset diabetes, type 1. Nobody's going to tell them, oh, well, you just have to go for a walk. You just have to, see your friends. It's like it's an illness. And the mental illness is an illness just like that. And so I think to reduce it to your point, just feeling sad or, concentrating on your blessings, it, that that really just does a disservice to the people that are struggling with this illness day in and day out, like my Max did. It just makes them feel unseen and unheard, and that's not the way we treat people who have a physical illness.
I also feel like it's sometimes overlooked that mental illnesses like depression and anxiety can also be partially caused by like a chemical imbalance in the brain, that like there can be a very physical like illness,
Mm-hmm.
that the same way that diabetes is an imbalance of insulin in your body, that sometimes it's an imbalance of chemicals in your brain.
And that also makes a lot of sense to why like medicines like antidepressants like work, because obviously if you need certain chemicals in your brain, or maybe your brain is like blocking certain transmitters or whatever, like that just proves your point to like why it's also like a physical manifestation as well.
Yeah, yeah. One point though that I also would like people to know, that we didn't know, is Max had something that was called medication resistant depression. So he tried umpteen, I don't even know how many, probably more than 20 different antidepressants, and none of them worked for him. And so that was really difficult for both he and us to understand because, this is the 21st century. We think you're sick, you take medication, and you're better. But that's not necessarily the case with a mental illness. One of the doctors that he saw told us trying to find a medication to treat depression is like trying on shoes without knowing your size. And so imagine the frustration of trying medication after medication after medication. And it's not like, an Advil, where if you have a headache and you take an Advil, your headache goes away. Antidepressants take time to get to a therapeutic level. And then if it doesn't work, you got to wean off and start something else. And it's just a very lengthy, cumbersome, and frustrating process. And I wish more people understood that as well.
Yeah, I feel like that point with like Advil, like it's like, oh, my head hurts, and you like take a pill or two and then you feel better like 30 minutes later. But like met with like antidepressants and a lot of those medications, like you have to start off at a low dose, work your way up to a point that works. And like I feel like that whole process, and also like you said, weaning off has got to take like a couple months. And then if you're trying like 20 different medications, just thinking about how many months that would take. And like I feel like that would also,
Like, say he spent,
yeah.
let's say, 6 months on 20 different medications. That's 120 months. That's 10 years of his life that he spent going between different medications, trying to find one that works, and none of them work. Like, I feel like that just has to be like so like disheartening. Like,
Yep. Yep. Good point.
Continuing on that topic, what insights about suicide and loss do you feel are important for parents and communities to better understand?
Well, first with suicide, the first thing I'll talk about is the terminology. So, oftentimes when someone dies by suicide, we hear that they committed suicide. That's the verbiage that's used. And that word committed really needs to be struck from our vocabulary as it relates to suicide, because we would never say someone committed a heart attack. And, the word committed indicates, usually it indicates illegal or immoral behavior, committed a crime, committed adultery, committed murder. And suicide is a tragedy, it's not a crime. And so I think we need to make sure that we're using the correct terminology when we're talking about suicide. And I didn't know that until we lost Max. And I remember reading that and thinking that makes so much sense, because when you hear somebody committed suicide, it gives you a very different impression and perception than when you hear somebody died by suicide or was the victim of suicide. Because there's a lot of research that shows that when a person takes his or her life, they're not in their right mind. So it's not a conscious, premeditated choice sometimes. Even if it is premeditated, even if it is planned, it's they're not in their right mind when they're making that decision. And so I just think we need to really be careful about the terminology that we use related to suicide. And then, the other thing about it is, I think oftentimes people want to reduce suicide to one single factor. And I know this because Max died during COVID. So people would say to me, he was basically a COVID victim, right? And yes, COVID was a factor in his death, but it wasn't the only factor. He had the pre-existing condition of depression. He had other lifestyle factors, other environmental factors, genetics at play. So all of those things come into they factor into a suicide. It's not one single issue. And I think to reduce it to one single issue is, again, not really understanding the depth of mental illness or the depth of a person, the depth of an individual. We're complex creatures. And so there's usually not one single factor for anything. It's always a combination of different factors. So I would say that's what I would want people to understand about suicide that I didn't understand prior to losing Max. And then I think when it comes to loss, I feel really strongly that we live in a grief illiterate culture. We don't talk about grief. We don't learn about grief. Uh, Grief and loss are not part of kind of our daily living like they used to be maybe 100 years ago. And so I think that when we experience a profound loss, we are unprepared for it and uneducated about it. And so is everybody around us. So it's this perfect storm of people feeling alone and misunderstood and judged. And then, for those that are trying to support, just this, complete lack, feel like they have a complete lack of resources when it comes to how to support those that are grieving. People just don't know, and it's not their fault. And so I just think that grief illiteracy really hurts us all. It hurts those of us that have lost somebody, and it hurts those of us around us who are trying to support us but don't know how. So I think those are some things that I think it's important to understand about loss and grief.
Your point about like the word like committed really stuck with me because I feel like when you say like, oh, she or he like or they whatever committed suicide, it almost feels like you're putting the blame on the person. Whereas if you say like, oh, death by suicide or like a victim of suicide, it's like you're placing the blame on the suicide, which is like obviously what you should be doing because committed just feels like you said the person was in the wrong or they did something immoral when we really shouldn't be viewing it that way.
Absolutely, absolutely, Kate.
Yeah.
So this is kind of building off of the previous question about grief, but how has your understanding of grief evolved since losing Max? what has surprised you most about the grieving process?
So I think, um, I don't know if I could say what surprised me the most. There have been lots of surprises. I think at first it was just the depth and the intensity of my grief. And the other thing was the length of grief. I think there's just sort of this understanding or misperception that, grief lasts for about a year. And then I don't know if you're supposed to be over it or past it or through it or whatever, but nothing could be further from the truth. I remember I got to the year anniversary of his death. And I think that first year I was doing a lot of things. Like I said, I was seeing a therapist. My husband and I were seeing a marriage therapist. I was on medication. I was exercising. I was, trying to eat well, do all those, things to help with my grief. And I remember, and I was probably also, there was a part of me that was probably like, I just got to get to a year. I just got to get to a year and then I'll feel a little bit better. And so when I got to that year anniversary and not only did I not feel better, in some ways I felt worse because the first year is getting through all the firsts, the first birthday, the first holidays, the first anniversary. And then after you get through all those firsts, you're just staring down at forever. And so I remember when I got to that year anniversary and I thought, oh, there's something wrong with me. Like I'm not fit for regular society. Maybe I need to like go to some kind of institution or something. And when I started really learning about grief, I realized that what I was feeling were just the natural and normal reactions and responses to losing someone so beloved. And I didn't know that. I didn't realize that. And so, there's just no timeline for grief. I didn't really understand that. We're going to grieve as long as we breathe because we love the person. The grief hopefully gets easier to carry as time goes by, but it'll never go away. And so, there's just been many, many things that I've learned about grief that have helped me as I have processed it and gone through these last 4.5 years. I just think education is so critical, so important.
I think it's really important, like you said, to recognize that everyone's journey with grief is different and it's also not necessarily linear. Like, it's not like, oh, you hit 1 year, like, you're going to feel better now. Like, it always stays with you, just maybe in different ways or like in different levels in your life as you go on.
Yep, yep, for sure.
Erin, we'd love to hear a little bit more about your book. Could you share a little bit with us about My Unexpected Journey, Reflections After Losing My Son to Suicide?
Yes, I would love to. So I kind of talked about, how it evolved. And, it's interesting. I never really sat down and said, I'm going to write a book. It just really did kind of evolve. And so I am incredibly proud of my book because not only does it help people get to know my Max, that's one of the most common comments that I get is people say, I didn't know Max, but I feel like I know him now through your book. And that really is just warms my mama's heart. But the other thing about the book is it's heavy because it's about the death of my son and it's about my pain. But I really tried to balance that heavy content with beauty. And so my graphic designer and illustrator, she came up with 6 original illustrations of a bird because I kept seeing the same bird in the days and weeks following Max's death. So those appear throughout the book. She used a lot of family photos and kind of created these beautiful artistic scrapbook type pages that appear throughout the book. And so I think that it is very accessible and very easy to digest to somebody who's grieving because it's these short little journal entries that are interspersed with pull-out quotes and illustrations and family photos, and it just makes it easy for somebody who's grieving to navigate. And so I'm really proud of it. It is available in both print and an EPUB on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And like I said, I'm just really proud of the resource because it would have been helpful for me if I had something like that. And so it's my hope that it is helpful to others. And not just parents who have lost a child to suicide. I think it's helpful to parents who lose a child in any way. I think it's helpful for people who lose a loved one in a traumatic way, whether that's a child, a spouse, a parent, whatever. And then I've also heard that it's helpful for those that are walking alongside the grieving because it helps them understand. It's a glimpse into the pain that the griever feels. And that's helpful to people who aren't going through that same pain themselves. So, I've gotten really tremendous feedback about it. I have, on Amazon, I have almost 80 five-star reviews. I have reviews from doctors and neurologists and therapists and coaches and just your average readers too. And I'm really proud of that. So, so that's a little bit about it.
That's amazing, the way you're able to use your grief to help others who are in the same position. That's honestly awesome. Okay. Would you be able to share with our listeners the other grief support services you offer to parents and how our listeners can get connected with you?
Yes. So, first of all, the best way to get connected to me is through my website, which is erinblechman.com. And that has information about my book. It has information about my speaking engagements that I do because I offer talks in the community that, again, elevate the conversation about mental illness, suicide, loss, and grief. I've done those at churches, some schools, some local businesses, uh, some libraries, just a combination or a variety of venues where I've done those. And then it also has information about my grief groups. And I offer short term online grief groups for bereaved parents. They're 6 weeks long. They're offered periodically throughout the year. I'm actually starting a new one tomorrow that will run for 6 weeks. And my groups combine education with support. Because, again, as I mentioned, it was so helpful to me to learn about grief, to learn concepts and terms and models for things that I had thought and felt. And so I just think it'll be helpful for others. So I try to bring that into my groups. And I just focus on bereaved parents because I think when you lose a child, it's unlike any other type of loss. And when you're with people who have experienced that same kind of loss, I just think it helps you to feel less alone. And, one of the other things that I often hear from grieving parents is kind of the way I felt. There must be something wrong with me. Like, why do I feel so badly? And so it's good to be with other parents who also have felt the way you're feeling or feeling that way now because it just helps you feel better understood. It's validating, it's normalizing, and that's really helpful. So those are the ways that I can come alongside grieving parents is through my book, through my community talks, through my grief groups, and the way that people can get in touch with me is through my website, which again is erinblechman.com.
I believe we can put the website in the podcast description as well. So if to anyone that's listening, if you go to the description under like the title of this podcast, you should be able to access the website. To conclude, we want to express our gratitude to St. Clair Health, whose support makes this podcast possible. We invite you to listen to the following message from our sponsor.
At St. Clair Health, we're always improving, building on our commitment to face the challenges of today, making an impact on the communities we serve, so we can be stronger together. St. Clair Health, expert care from people who care.
If you would like to hear more about Erin's journey, her book, My Unexpected Journey, is available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble, or visit her website, erinblechman.com. That's ErinBlechman.com. Also, join Erin for an informative parenting workshop exploring grief and loss on Thursday, February 13th from 7 to 8 p.m. via Zoom webinar. The workshop will provide insights to help deepen understanding of these challenging topics discussed in this episode. Sign up by emailing Outreach's Program Manager, Maggie Zangara, at mzangara@outreachteen.org, and later this month you'll be able to also sign up on our website. We are so grateful to each and every one of you for tuning in and supporting our podcast. Erin, thank you so much for being here and sharing your story and the story of your son Max with us today. Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much, Erin.
Thank you, girls. It was really nice talking to you.
It was amazing talking to you too.
The views and opinions expressed in the Teens Tap In podcast represent the opinions of the hosts and their guests. The views and opinions expressed by Outreach Teen and Family Services employees, donors, and volunteers are their own and do not necessarily reflect the view of Outreach Teen and Family Services or the show's sponsors. The content here should not be taken as counseling advice. The content here is for informational purposes only, and because each person is unique, please consult your mental health provider or physician for any mental health counseling or other medical questions. The podcast should not be used in any legal capacity whatsoever, including, but not limited to, establishing a standard of care in a legal sense, or as a basis for expert witness testimony. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast. If you find any error in any of the content of the podcast, please contact us at podcasts@outreachteen.org. Outreach Teen and Family Services, its sponsors, donors, and partners expressly disclaim any and all liability or responsibility for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, consequential, or other damages whatsoever arising out of any individual's use of, reference to, reliance on, or inability to use this podcast or the information presented in this podcast. Please go to www.outreachteen.org to see the complete notice and disclaimer for the podcast episodes.